Hey everyone, welcome back. In the last lesson, we finished up most of the business logic for our shopping cart. All that's missing now is adding Stripe so we can actually make payments. So we can click on this button and the shipping button and the place order button. So let's get started. Go ahead and open up a browser and open up a new tab and go to stripe.com. And we're going to look in the developers and then the mobile apps, and then under iOS, go to view guide. And we're gonna start out kind of just by following their iOS integration guide. So it says here that the Stripe iOS SDK makes it easy to build an excellent payment experience in your iOS app. It provides powerful, customizable UI elements to use out of the box to collect your users' payment details. And we also expose the low-level APIs that power those elements to make it easy to build fully custom forms. This guide will take you all the way from integrating our SDK to accepting payments from your users via both credit cards and Apple Pay. Right now, we're just going to be working with credit cards. And if you'd like to see a complete iOS example, check out Rocket Rides, built using the iOS SDK and Stripe Connect. And in one of the live videos, I believe it's number 13, we actually go through setting up this Rocket Rides example, and I show you how to set up the local server and everything there. All right, so first thing we're going to need to do is install and configure the SDK using CocoaPods. We've already done that, so we've already installed the Stripe CocoaPod. So next thing we need to do is configure your Stripe integration in your app delegate, okay? So we're going to need this line right here. And if you're logged in, it will already have your test publishable key, okay? So just copy that and then back into Xcode. We're going to go to our app delegate right here under the Artable project. And I'm going to go ahead and paste that. We'll also need to import Stripe right here, import Stripe. And then that should be good. Now remember, this publishable key, this is a key that's okay to have in your client app. You have to have it here. It's non-sensitive, all right? So that's good. We're gonna come back here to Safari, and we're not going to set up Apple Pay in this course. A little bit here about using Stripe versus Apple's in-app purchases. You may be wondering how you can get around Apple's 30% cut for its in-app purchases. And the reason that this is a little bit different is it says here, you can use any of Stripe's supported payment methods in your iOS app to sell physical goods, for example, groceries and clothing, or for services your business provides, club memberships, hotel reservations. And these payments are processed through Stripe, and you only need to pay Stripe's processing fees. So for these types of commodities and goods, whether they're physical goods or services your business provides, then you don't have to go through Apple's in-app purchase and they don't take a cut. However, if you're doing things like digital content functionality or services in your app, such as premium content for your app or subscriptions for digital content, then you have to use in-app purchases, and then you're subject to Apple's 30% transaction fees. All right, so here we have standard versus custom UI components. And it says the simplest way to integrate our SDK is using the STP payment context. And if you click on that here, you can see here some of the documentation for it. It says that the Stripe payment context keeps track of all of the state around a payment, meaning that it will manage fetching a user's saved payment methods, tracking any information they select, and prompting them for required additional information before completing their purchase. It can be used to power your application's payment confirmation page with just a few lines of code. All right, so that sounds pretty nice. One thing that we need to also have is that the Stripe payment context saves information about a user's payment methods to a Stripe customer object and requires a Stripe customer context to manage retrieving and modifying the customer. So we're going to be working mostly with these two classes, the Stripe payment context and the Stripe customer context. And it says here that the Stripe customer context retrieves and updates a Stripe customer using an ephemeral key, a short-lived API key scoped to a specific customer object. If your current user logs out of your app and a new user logs in, be sure to either create a new instance or clear the current instance's cached customer. On your backend, be sure to create and return a new ephemeral key for the customer object associated with the new user, okay? And this guy right here, this ephemeral key, that's what we're gonna be working with in this lesson. We need to create a backend function that creates and returns this ephemeral key, okay? So coming back to our iOS integration tab here, continuing here, it says simplest ways, the Stripe payment context, a class designed to make building your app's checkout flow as easy as possible, handles collecting, saving, and reusing your user's payment details. That's mostly what we just read already. If you find that the standard UI components are not flexible enough for your needs, you can use the custom UI components. But like I said, we're going to be using the standard UI components, so go ahead and click right here on this link using standard UI components. And that brings us over here. And this intro is pretty much the same stuff, just introducing the Stripe payment context. It says, think of it as the data source for your checkout view controller. It handles retrieving the data you need asynchronously, notifies its delegate when to update the UI, and most importantly, it lets you build a single integration to accept payments via both credit card and Apple Pay instead of having multiple code paths. All right, so to work with the Stripe payment context, we're going to need to write a class that conforms to this Stripe payment context delegate, and we'll work on that in the next lesson. But first off, what we need to do is set up an ephemeral key, okay? So it says here that in order for our pre-built UI elements to function, you'll need to provide them with an ephemeral key, a short-lived API key with restricted API access. You can think of an ephemeral key as a session authorizing the SDK to retrieve and update a specific customer object for the duration of the session. Okay, so what we're going to do is we are going to create a backend function that is going to create this ephemeral key. And the ephemeral key, it needs the customer ID and the Stripe version, okay? And the customer ID, this is the Stripe customer ID that we see in our database for each new user that we create. So just gonna open up one of these real quick. And we see here the, let's see here. We have one with a Stripe ID. Here we go. So customer, and then this customer's Stripe ID right here. And then what that does is we pass that information to Stripe. It generates this ephemeral key, a short-lived API key with restricted API access. And then we send that back to our client app. And then using that ephemeral key, we create our Stripe customer context class, which then retrieves all of the Stripe customer information. All right, so that's kind of the flow here. Okay, so it says to provide an ephemeral key to the SDK, you'll need to expose a new API endpoint on your backend. This endpoint should create an ephemeral key for the current Stripe customer and return the key's unmodified response as JSON. When the SDK requests an ephemeral key, it will specify the version of the Stripe API, as well as the customer ID. And this is what the code is going to kind of look like when we write it. It's going to be a little bit different since we're not using Express. So we're going to say stripe.ephemeralkeys.create. We pass in the customer ID, the Stripe version, and then we get back the key. And then we can catch any errors. All right, so let's get cracking. We're going to create a new cloud function that generates this ephemeral key. So open up Code, Visual Studio Code. All right, so here we are with our cloud functions. So far, we've seen two types of cloud function triggers. The first was our demo hello world cloud function, and this was just a simple HTTPS on request function in which we are given a URL that could be used to invoke this cloud function. The second was what's called a background trigger, and it is invoked upon a new document being created in a given collection. Now we're going to look at the third kind, which is called a callable function. So back in our browser, go ahead and open up a new tab and search for Firebase callable function. And go ahead and click on this one right here, call functions from your app. And as it says here, callable functions are similar to other HTTP functions with these additional features. With callables, Firebase authentication and FCM tokens, when available, are automatically included in the requests. The function's HTTPS on call trigger automatically deserializes the request body and validates auth tokens. All right, so those are both really nice features. Instead of passing any authentication to our backend and then doing additional verification there, it's already automatically passed. We still need to check that the request is valid, but we have it right there built in. We also have client SDKs, which makes it really easy to call these functions without having to use something like Alamofire or URL session. Okay, so let's take a look at how to write and deploy a callable function. Okay, so similarly to our demo function, we have here functions.https, but instead of .onRequest, what we have here is .onCall. Okay, so that's the syntax, that's the trigger, and we get from that a data object and context. Okay, we've discussed context. This has things like your authentication and some other things. The data is a JSON object that is passed up from the client app. So in the case of our ephemeral key, this is going to include our customer ID and the Stripe version that we need. To send data back to our client app upon a successful result, we say return data that can be JSON encoded. So with our ephemeral function, we're going to be returning that ephemeral key. Now, if there is an error, then we throw a class called functions.https error, okay? And this has a code, an error code right here, and then a message that is returned to the client app. Now, these error codes, these have to be a specific string. And you can see which error codes are available by clicking here on functions.https error. And then let's see here. Here we have the available codes. Canceled, unknown, not found, permission denied, etc. So these are the available error codes that you can include for these callable HTTPS errors. Okay. All right, so that's kind of the structure of a callable function. The next parts here is how to actually call those functions from our client apps, which we will get into in the next lessons. Okay, but for now, we want to go ahead and create our cloud function that will retrieve an ephemeral key given a customer ID and Stripe version. So back into code. Let's go ahead and do that. We're going to create a new function. So I'm going to say exports dot create ephemeral key is equal to functions dot https dot on call. Then I'm going to do open close parentheses. Inside of that, I'm going to say async, then another open close parentheses. And we have here the data and context that we get from the request. Then I'm going to say arrow, and then open, close, curly brace, and return. All right, so now we have our skeleton for our function. And like I said, we're going to need a couple of variables. We need to know the customer ID and the Stripe version. So we can get that from our data object here. And again, this is a JSON object that is passed from our client app. And one of the nice things about callable is that that data is automatically serialized for us. So we can get it very simply by saying const customer ID is equal to data dot customer underscore ID, okay? And we haven't written this code yet, but this is going to be the key for the value that we pass up in the JSON object. And then we can get the Stripe version by saying const Stripe version is equal to data dot Stripe underscore version. And this will be the key for the value that we pass from the client app. Now we also want to check to make sure that this request is coming from an authenticated user. So let's create a variable for the UID, all right? So we're gonna say const UID is equal to context.auth.UID, okay? And this UID is the identifier for the Firebase user, the same ID that you would see in the authentication tab of your console. Just coming over here real quick. So same as this ID right here. Okay, back into code. And if there is an ID here, then the request is good. If there's no ID, then the request is not authenticated, and we should throw an error and return out of this function. So let's do that. We're gonna say if the UID is equal to null, so 3 equal signs right here. If it's null, then we are going to say, let's go ahead and do a console log as well. I'm gonna say console.log, and we'll say illegal access attempt due to unauthenticated user, okay? And then we need to throw an error here. So we're gonna say throw new functions .https error. It says here, an explicit error that can be thrown from a handler to send an error to the client that called the function. Okay, and remember this has 2 arguments. We have a error code and a message. So going back to our Safari, if we look at our HTTPS error codes, I think that a good one would be this permission denied, okay? So I'm going to copy this, come back into code, and just paste that right there. So that's our error code. And if you don't have it spelled right, or you think that you can put something of your own in there, when you try to deploy to Firebase, you're gonna get an error saying that it's not a valid error code, okay? So you gotta use one of the ones right here. And then we can provide a message that is returned to the client app, and we'll just say something like illegal access attempt. All right, so now we know that we have a valid request, so we can continue to communicate with the Stripe servers and pass them our customer ID, our Stripe version, and say, pretty please, can we have an ephemeral key for this customer ID, which we will then pass back to our client app. So the way to do that is we are going to say return Stripe dot ephemeral keys dot create. And if you're wondering where I got that, that's right here in our guide for using the iOS standard integration, stripe.ephemeralkeys.create. And then we need to pass the customer ID and the Stripe version. So back in code, we're going to say open close parentheses, then return. And we are going to provide in curly braces customer colon, and then our customer ID variable that we created right here. And then we also need to pass the Stripe version. So I'm going to say Stripe underscore version, and then pass into it the Stripe version variable. And then we're going to say dot then. So after Stripe has communicated with its servers and has a response for us, I'm going to say open close parentheses, then open close parentheses again. And inside of the inner parentheses, I'm going to say key. And then I'm going to say arrow and open close curly brace. And here we are going to return that key, okay? So here we request that we create the ephemeral key. We pass to Stripe the customer ID and the Stripe version. If it's successful, then we get back the key and then we return that key to the client app. And at that point, the cloud function is complete. However, if there is an error, so I'm going to say dot catch, open close parentheses, open close parentheses, and we'll call this error, and then arrow, and then open close curly brace. If there's an error, then we're going to log that error and throw a functions HTTPS error. So I'm going to say console.log, and we're going to log the error, okay? And then we're going to throw a new functions.https error. And again, we have our two parameters here, an error code and a message. And so let's go ahead and take a look at our errors again. And I'm thinking maybe an internal error. So basically we'll say that this is Stripe's fault. So we're going to come back into code and say internal, and then we'll say unable to create ephemeral key. All right, very good. So just to recap what we have going on here, we have our cloud function called Create Ephemeral Key. This is a callable function, and we have the data and the context. Data is the JSON object that is passed in the request from our client app, and in there we have our customer ID and our Stripe version that we get from data. And we also have the UID that we can get from the context. We do a check to make sure that this is an authenticated request, meaning that it's coming from a user on one of our client apps that has an account. And if that works, then we are going to request from our Stripe server a new ephemeral key. We pass it the customer ID and the Stripe version, and it returns the key if it's successful. If not, we catch it and throw a new error. All right, so there we go. We have our new endpoint. We can save this and open up terminal and make sure you're in your cloud functions directory and that you're logged in with your CLI. And then you can say Firebase deploy, and that will deploy our new create ephemeral key function to our Artable project. All right, so I'm going to let this deploy. In the next lesson, we're going to continue working with our standard iOS integration, Stripe components, and I will see you there.